I want this to be really interactive, so if you have questions specifically about your operation, what you're doing, how you do something, please stop us at any time. That's the most important thing that I want you to take away from today is in my operation and how I do things, how does this fit with me? So I would rather throw away and not get through half the slides that are in this deck and actually have a conversation with you about your operations than anything else. So please be sure to do that. So some of you know me, some of you do not. My name is Holly Mobby. I work for Dakota College at Bottineau. I'm the director of their Entrepreneurial Center for Horticulture, which is a really long title, for a part of our college that works with small farms and producers like you all across the state. As a part of that, I'm also the executive director for the Farmers Market and Growers Association. So that's another way that I can really get involved with the farmers markets, the growers, the producers all across the state. We do workshops like this, we do workshops on straight up farm safety, we do production work, and right on our college at Dakota College, we believe in walking the walk and talking the talk. So we have a demonstration site with 7 high tunnels and outside gardens, and we grow a whole lot of produce that we put into our students all year long. So that's kind of how we make sure that we keep our hands in the dirt as well. One of my goals for doing these workshops and why I wrote for the grant and was so glad we got it was because I felt it was important to get our producers not only in touch with us, but also with Antton back there, you're trying to take a photo.
Got it.
All right, now you have to come up here and introduce yourself.
Absolutely. As Holly was saying, my name is Antton Sattler. I'm the Environmental Health Administrator for the City of Bismarck. I have cards in the back. If you want one, feel free to take one. We're basically the health inspectors for the City of Bismarck. We only cover the City of Bismarck too. I guess that should be noted. We don't do anything with Mandan. We're actually for the rest of Burleigh County. That's actually covered by food and lodging. But in regards, some of the things that we do, a lot of food regulations. Like I said, we're the health inspectors for any food establishment, whether it's a grocery store, bar, convenience store, full-scale restaurant, etc. Temporary food establishments, mobile food establishments. We also license and inspect routinely tanning facilities, body art facilities, piercers, tattooers, cosmetic tattooers. Lodging establishments, public and semi-public swimming pools, and we get to do nuisance complaints like junk storage. If your neighbor's yard looks like your junkyard, we're the ones that get to go out and investigate them and tell them, hey, you need to clean it up. So that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Antton. Antton is going to help answer questions because, as all of you probably know, in North Dakota we have some local things that are maybe different than statewide, and I am not an expert on everything, and so I always make sure that I have backup. And Antton, and also Kalee, right? We've got a couple of Kalees in here right now. Kalee is here from the State Health Department, State Department of Health, and so maybe you can come up and introduce yourself too, please.
Sure.
And I know you probably could do it from back there, but we want to get your pretty face on camera.
I'm Kalee Werner. I work with the Division of Food and Lodging as their program administrator. So like Antton said, we do Burleigh County, we do a lot of the other counties, so the local public health units will take a lot of the larger areas, so Minot, Grand Forks, Fargo, Bismarck, Williston, Dickinson, and then we do the counties outside of that. So we'll do the health inspections for the food, the lodging, mobile homes, trailer parks, campgrounds, different things like that. So I'm just here to observe today. So if you have any questions, let me know.
Thanks, Katie. The other thing about myself and talking about walking the walk and talking the talk is my husband and son and I are also producers, just like you. We've been doing it since 2002. We started at farmers markets and direct sale, and we moved into wholesale, and we've been selling to restaurants and grocery stores, and we have to follow all of these rules just like everybody else. And so some of them I have learned the hard way, and some of them have been easy lessons and some of them have been not. And so I really enjoy what I do because hopefully I can make it easier or smoother for the next person. So, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Now that we've done those. First, we wanna start out with, of course, just why should we be concerned? These are the topics we're gonna cover. Outbreaks of foodborne illness, very briefly, we're gonna go through some of the outbreaks, different types of produce that have caused them, which regulations apply to me. That's where we're gonna spend the majority of our time. What regulations apply to you, what are they, and how do you make sure that your operation is good to go within those. And then the 6 areas of the Food Safety Modernization Act and Good Agricultural Practices, that's what those 2 acronyms are, that affect producers. Those 6 areas, they're all in your book, they're all in the handouts, and that's where we'll probably end up speeding up towards the end of the day, because we'll have covered a certain amount of those things as we go forward. So we'll start with, why do we need food safety training? Mainly comes about because of our concern of foodborne illness. We just had another one in the news the other day. Annually, 1 out of every 6 individuals can get sick from foodborne illnesses. 130,000 are hospitalized, and there are 3,000 deaths. A large number of them are never reported. So those numbers are only based on the ones that people get sick enough to actually go to the doctor or sick enough to report. And unfortunately, 3,000 deaths. There probably, and most likely, are many, many more foodborne illnesses out there that we don't know. Particularly at risk, of course, are children, the elderly, and those that have compromised immune systems. So when we're thinking about what we do, of course, those are the populations we don't want to make anybody sick. But heaven forbid we made an elderly person ill or a child ill. That would be even more awful than making anybody ill. Foodborne diseases can happen to any size of operation. It's not just the big guys. I know a lot of times we like, as producers, to tell ourselves, oh, that's just, it's coming out of the big fields out in California with migrant workers, and they have hundreds of thousands of people that don't wash their hands or whatever. We like to tell ourselves that, but really it can happen at any size of operation. And the last thing we want is for that to be us, right? We don't want to be the breaking news at 6 o'clock on Channel 11. Guess what? Somebody's cantaloupe at a farmer's market made a whole bunch of people ill. We don't want to be on the front page of the paper or that magazine. So we really want to protect our customers and ourselves. So when we're looking at outbreaks, I thought this was kind of interesting because yes, some of these things we don't grow here. We don't grow papayas. But take a look at 25% is leafy greens. That's, lettuce, kale, all of those leafy greens. 25% of the outbreaks. That's quite a bit. And there are other things on here that we do grow. Tomatoes, 10%. Melons, another 10%. Many of us that do produce do those types of produce. In fact, we do almost all of them until you get down here to 2% to the mangoes. And I looked at it because we're an herb farm. We grow culinary and cooking herbs. Basil, parsley, and cilantro is what we grow. 5% of the outbreaks came from the products that I grow, the types of products that I grow. So we really do want to be careful and concerned about what we're growing, how we're growing it, and how we're getting it to market. So what happens if there is an outbreak? Somebody gets ill, they go to the doctor determines it is a foodborne illness, then what? And this, actually, when I did it in Minot, was where I asked my local folks to come up and walk through. Maybe Kalee or Antton, do you want to kind of walk through what happens when there's an outbreak?
Sure.
That'd be awesome.
Basically what happens is, depending on where the outbreak occurs, the local health department is going to work with the state health department and probably a couple different divisions from the state health department. Disease control. There's a division of disease control that have epidemiologists kind of stationed throughout the state. We have a disease control employee that works here that we communicate with on a regular basis. As well as, if we had a foodborne outbreak that occurred here in Bismarck, we're going to be in direct contact with Kalee's office. And it's really just basically a trace back and trying to find out, okay, who's all ill? Who are the cases, as they would call them? And then what did they consume? And we're going to want to go back, not just at that event that is suspect, but you're going to want to go back at minimum 72 hours. Obviously, the red flag is going to be that communal event that everyone participated in. And then trying to diagnose which food specifically was the cause of the outbreak, which is often not the easiest thing to do. That's where like the epidemiologists with disease control are going to give surveys to all the cases to try to track that down. And really, it's just the two departments, us, the local, and the state health department, working in conjunction with each other to try to determine what caused the foodborne outbreak. The food handlers or the food employees are going to be questioned, if it was a licensed establishment or not. And that's likely going to happen by the local public health unit. Myself or the environmental health specialist will go to that establishment and just talk to them. For many foodborne outbreaks, it's not uncommon that it can be traced back to an ill food handler. And we're going to ask things like that. Have you had any recent ill food handlers? If so, could you give us what information you have for the past 2 weeks? Usually we go by, I'd say at minimum, wanting to know who was ill. Am I missing anything, Kalee? It's really a lot of it's a case-by-case basis and just trying to figure out what happened, what went wrong.
One of the things Antton mentioned was traceback, and we'll talk about your end of traceback when we get a little bit further into this. I'll protect you. One thing that Antton didn't take it to was the next, for you, producer level, the preventative or corrective action. If it comes back and they find out, oh my goodness, it was my cantaloupe that made people sick. What do you do about it? What is the preventative or corrective action that you need to take? And that's where knowing these folks is really going to be important, because they would help you determine what that preventative or corrective action would be. So the microorganisms we're most concerned about is there's 3 different types. There's bacteria, there's viruses, and there's parasites. Bacteria, we hear about salmonella, we hear about E. coli and listeria, probably most common in the outbreaks that we get into the news. Viruses, norovirus, hepatitis A, we hear about those all the time. We don't hear about the parasites quite as much, and just as soon as I started saying that, a really good friend of mine who is actually a doctor came down with Giardia. We sometimes think of that as being waterborne in, Guatemala or wherever, but he hasn't been out of the country. So, first of all, bacteria, they're microorganisms that can multiply outside and inside the host. So that's kind of important to know. Bacteria can multiply on surfaces outside the host. They include the things that I just mentioned, listeria, salmonella, E. coli. They multiply really rapidly, given the right conditions. And what are the right conditions? The right conditions are water, food, and the proper temperature. So as we go forward, keep that in the back of your mind when we start talking about holding certain foods at a certain temperature, or making sure that they're dry enough or they're not building up a lot of moisture, because that's really what can make those multiply, the bacteria multiply. Good agricultural practices can reduce some of that. And here's how fast they multiply. Your time, 20 minutes, if you only have two bacteria, 2 microscopic, can't see them with the naked eye bacteria. At 8 hours, you have 16,777,216. Now, with this timeline, I want you to think through in your head. When you go home and you pick your produce or you bake your baked goods, How long is it from the time you pick until the time you sell that last one at market? Or the time you bake and the time you sell that last one in market? If it's contaminated with 2, are you here? Are you down here? It can multiply up really fast. Then there's the viruses. Viruses are small particles. Living in the North Country here, we know a lot about viruses, cold and flu viruses, right? This is not a word we're unfamiliar with. They multiply only in a host, not in the environment or on the outside of the produce. Contamination is most often, as Antton said, linked to an ill worker or somebody who has been handling the produce or the product who's ill. It only takes a few virus particles to make someone sick. They can be very stable in the environment though, so where they might not multiply, they can live on surfaces. Okay? Prevention is the key because there are limited options for effective sanitizers in this case. Last one is parasites. They're protozoa or intestinal worms that can only multiply in a host animal or the human, commonly transmitted by water. So you're going to hear us talk a lot today about water, because water actually is the most common way that all of these things are spread. They can survive in the body for long periods of time before they show any signs of causing an illness. So they are particularly hard to track back to somewhere. Fresh produce is often consumed raw. We buy those fresh carrots, we go home, we don't cook them, we eat them. We buy that fresh cucumber, we go home, we put it in our salad. So because most of our produce is consumed raw, that's why we really have this concern with making sure that the things we do not compound the issue of bacteria or virus or parasites. Microbial contamination on produce, it's really tough to remove once it's there because there are natural openings in all of our produce. And think of all the little places on that melon for microscopic organisms to live. They've got rough surfaces and folds. And also contamination is often sporadic. We usually won't see, oh, the whole field was bad, or the whole shipment was bad. It's going to be just a few pieces. It's very sporadic. And bacteria can multiply on those surfaces and include wounds, as we said, really quickly. So, how is contamination spread? Us. We're kind of one of the biggest ways that contamination is being spread. It's spread because we're not washing our hands good enough. Maybe we are injured while we're picking our produce. Maybe we don't have enough toileting facilities. And I say that, and again, people often think, we don't have enough toileting facilities. Again, that's the big guys down in California or down south, right? No, that's you out in the field. And Bonnie, I don't mean to pick on you, hon, but I've been to your place, and it's a heck of a hike up that hill to the house, right? Yeah.
And that's you out there, you're working, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, it's a heck of a hike up the hill. I can just, nobody's looking, I can go in the weeds over here, right? We can't do those things if we really want to be safe and we want to be sure. Another way, of course, is animals, domestic or wild animals. They carry and transmit a lot of pathogens, and it's really tough to keep those deer out of your field, and it's impossible to keep the birds from flying over, your production area. Field intrusions and direct fecal contamination of crops is one of the #1 contamination routes when we're looking at animals. Animals can contaminate water sources that we then use to water our produce, and manure runoff can also contaminate. The water that we use to water things with in production, or we're using it to wash our produce afterwards, can very easily spread a lot of contamination. Now, a couple weeks ago, I did this in Minot, and of course, up in Minot with the Mouse River and everything, they experience flooding every now and again. And that flooding brings in all sorts of pathogens to their fields. You guys have had flooding down here, but not quite as often as maybe the Red River Valley or other areas, but flooding and runoff can bring in contamination as well. We've dealt with that several times. Another way contamination is spread is through soil amendments. We'll talk about composting and manure later. I'm a big fan of composting and using manure. We just have to be really careful how, when, where, all of those things. Because these are the pieces that can affect that contamination. Improper storage, wind spread of it, improper or incomplete treatment, or application too close to harvest. We can also spread contamination on the surface of what we're using. And here's, this one is my big pet peeve. So you'll always know when it's my pet peeve because I stop. I gotta come back here and get something. Now, first of all, I understand this is not, let me preface this by saying this is not a bucket I use with my produce. It did contain hydraulic oil. All of my buckets are food grade buckets. So this would not be considered a food grade bucket. But let's just pretend for a minute. It's winter, right? And at my place, we also have a few sheep. And right now, we're hauling water for the sheep, right? We don't have that many that I need to have a heated, anything more than a small heated water tank, right? So we fill that with a 5-gallon bucket every day. So the bucket goes in, it gets filled with water, I carry it out, what do? I pour it in the sheep water tank, and I set it down. And I pet my pretty ewes, because they're really lovey right now, because they're gonna lamb soon. And I pick it back up. So what happens in the summer then, when that bucket gets picked back up, nobody looks at the bottom. And out into the field it goes, and the cucumbers get picked, and they get picked right into there. I now have a contaminated tool, don't I? I have a contaminated bucket that really doesn't belong in my production field. It's really easy to do. You don't know, you're walking along and you're thinking, oh, I should dig that weed out. There's that really big thistle that I really should dig that out. So you go and you grab the first shovel you see and you dig out that thistle. And you don't know that half an hour ago that shovel was being used to scoop dog poo in the yard. Okay, so our tools and our equipment is probably one of the most overlooked areas of contamination. So we want to make sure, at our house, we color code everything. If it's a shovel for the sheep, it's coated with green. It's got green spray paint on the handle. Cleaning versus sanitizing, this is another one that we really have to kind of keep in our heads. What's the difference? Cleaning is the physical removal of dirt. You're washing the dirt, you're cleaning off the bottom of your boots, you're cleaning off your tools. Sanitizing is treatment of the surface with a sanitizer. And the key thing is you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. You have to get it clean first, get the dirt off first, and then sanitize it. This will really come into play when we start talking about, so what do we do with that shovel that went someplace it shouldn't, or that bucket that went someplace it shouldn't, okay? It needs to be 4 steps to the treatment, really. Washed, rinsed, sanitized, and then air dried. Because we want to clean it first, then sanitize it, then let it air dry. We want to get that dirt off first.